The most beloved cartoon sponge in the world has been pulled from the air, blamed for harming children's minds, accused of pushing hidden messages, and named in a sermon in front of members of Congress. One of his episodes drove a character to lie down in the road and wait to be run over, and the show played part of it for laugh. A famous scene was quietly cut and erased from nearly every copy. A university professor called the cheerful little town a violent and racist place. A study said 9 minutes of the show could dull a young child's thinking. Tonight, over the next while, we are going to drift slowly through all of it. The episodes people could not forgive, the jokes that vanished, the parents who panicked, and the fights that spilled far past Bikini Bottom. None of it will keep the eyes open. Let the stories roll gently on. Welcome to Cartoonology. Let's get started. The Panty Raid That Vanished. A television network holds a strange kind of power over the things it makes. It can spend money and time building an episode, hand it to writers and animators and voice actors, send it out to millions of homes, and then years later reach back into its own shelf and decide that the episode should no longer be seen. The show carries on. The other episodes keep playing. Only one quietly goes missing, slipping out of the rotation so gently that most people never notice it is gone. SpongeBob SquarePants has had this happen to it, and the first and most talked about case began with a story that seemed harmless when it aired, and grew into something the company felt it could no longer stand behind. The episode in question comes from the 3rd season of the show, the stretch of years many fans still point to as the very best the series ever produced. It first reached television in early 2003, tucked into the back half of an episode as one of the show's shorter segments. The series often worked this way, pairing 2 small 11-minute stories together to fill a single half-hour slot. This particular short was built around Mr. Krabs, the money-loving crab who runs the little restaurant at the center of the whole show, and at the start, there is almost nothing about it that feels like trouble. The setup is soft and even a little sad. Mr. Krabs wakes one morning and finds that he can barely drag himself out of bed. The years are starting to weigh on him, and a quiet fear takes hold that he is growing old and slipping out of step with the world around him. The worry gnaws at him through the early scenes. Then a customer takes a bite of a Krabby Patty and grumbles that the burger tastes old and dried out, as though the food itself had aged past its best days. The insult stings far more than it should, because it lands right on the sore spot the crab is already nursing. He becomes convinced that he has to prove, to himself most of all, that he can still be young and lively and fun the way the customers half his age seem to be. So he decides to go out for a wild night on the town, and he drags SpongeBob and Patrick along with him. The choice is a poor one from the very beginning, because the two of them are about the least cool companions a person could pick for an evening of excitement. Their idea of a thrilling night involves watching clothes spin around inside a laundry machine, sitting at a table playing slow and quiet games, and even paying a visit to the dentist for fun. Each dull stop leaves the old crab more frustrated than the laugh, until he is ready to give up on the whole sorry adventure and simply go home to bed. The turn that eventually got the entire episode pulled arrives near the end. Desperate for one real thrill before the night collapses entirely, the three of them settle on a plan that the show calls a raid on a stranger's underwear drawer. They sneak through the dark towards someone's house, creep inside it room by room, and begin pulling undergarments straight out of a dresser. The whole joke is built around how naughty and daring this feels to the three friends, how their hearts pound at the sheer mischief of it. They behave as though they are pulling off the boldest crime of their lives, when all they are really doing is rummaging through a stranger's clothing in the dark. The punchline comes when the house turns out to belong to Mr. Krabs' own mother. The drawer they have been quietly emptying is hers. She catches the three of them in the act, asks what on earth they think they are doing with her belongings, and the night ends with her grounding her grown son and sending him to his childhood bedroom, where, oddly enough, he finally feels young again. Watched as a child, the segment plays as a goofy bit of mischief that loops back to a silly, gentle ending. Watched years later by people whose sense of what belongs in a children's show had shifted, the scene reads very differently. Looked at with a careful eye, the sequence stacks up several uncomfortable things all at once. There is the breaking into a home that does not belong to them. There is the creeping through it in the dark. There is the theft of personal clothing, and then the added strangeness of it being the underwear of a family member. None of it was ever meant as more than light slapstick at the time, and the show plays every beat of it purely for laughs, never once treating it as something sinister. The trouble is that a pile of small wrongdoings framed as a fun adventure on a channel made for young children can look very different once enough years have passed and the people in charge go back to watch it again with stricter rules in mind. For a very long stretch, none of this caused any visible problem at all. The episode aired in the normal way, was rerun again and again, and was watched by a whole generation of kids who grew up quoting its jokes and never once thought twice about the underwear gag at its center. The standards of what felt acceptable on a children's channel slowly shifted underneath it during all those years, the way standards always do, without any single dramatic moment marking the change. What seemed merely cheeky in one decade began to look like a genuine concern in the next, even though not a single frame of the episode itself had been altered. The first real move against it came in the year 2018. After a review of its own older content, the network quietly took the episode out of rotation, explaining that some parts of the story were no longer judged suitable for children. The underwear raid stood out as the obvious reason behind the decision, even though the company kept its public wording broad and careful. A representative would later describe the removal as the result of a standards review in which certain story elements were found to be not appropriate for kids. At first, the change went almost completely unnoticed, because even though the episode had left the regular television schedule, it could still be found in plenty of other places. People who wanted to watch it still could. That quiet removal sat mostly out of view for around 3 years. The bigger wave of attention arrived later, and it came tied to the rise of streaming. When a new streaming service launched as the main home for the show, sharp-eyed viewers began to notice that this one segment was missing from it entirely. Every other episode was there. This one was not. Reporters started asking the network why, and the company repeated its explanation about the older content review, while declining to go into much detail about exactly which moments had triggered the concern. When pressed on whether it had considered gentler options, such as adding a warning before the episode instead of scrubbing it altogether, the response was simply that there would be no comment. Around that same stretch of time, the episode also vanished from a service where people had once been able to buy it outright. One of the last easy and official doors to watching it swung shut. What had begun as a quiet shuffle off the television schedule had grown, by 2021, into something close to a total removal. The segment was stripped from the main streaming home of the show, disappearing from the very place where most modern viewers go when they want to revisit an old favorite. A piece of the series that millions of people had seen dozens of times became suddenly, strangely difficult to reach through almost any official path at all. The ban, for all its reach, was never truly airtight, and a show pulling an episode in the modern age turns out to be a leaky thing. Copies of the segment lived on in the hands of fans who had recorded it from television years earlier. For a while, it could still be purchased through a small number of online shops, even as it was missing from the main streaming service. The work had already spread too far across the world to ever be fully erased. The episode kept drifting around in unofficial corners of the internet, traded and re-uploaded by people who refused to let a banned piece of their childhood quietly disappear. At one point, the full segment was even posted in its entirety on social media, where curious viewers could watch the very scene that had caused all the fuss and judge it for themselves. A particularly odd twist arrived a couple of years after the removal had hardened, and it only deepened how clumsily the whole affair had been handled. For a brief moment, the banned episode popped back up on streaming, appearing through one of the larger platforms where it was tied to the service. Fans spotted it almost immediately and spread the word with real excitement, treating the reappearance as a sign that the long exile might finally be over. The return lasted only a short while. Within days it was gone again, and the company explained that the episode had shown up by mistake, the result of a technical error rather than any decision to welcome it back. Even its brief return turned out to be an accident the network hurried to undo, snatching the segment away almost as soon as people had found it. Not everyone agreed that the episode deserved to vanish in the first place, and among fans, the removal set off an argument that still flares up now and then. Some pointed out that cartoons, including this very one, are packed with all sorts of slapstick danger and mischief that never gets pulled, and they wondered aloud why a goofy underwear gag was treated as the single line that could not be crossed. Characters in the show have been blown up, set on fire, and put through every kind of cartoon mayhem without any of it being scrubbed from the record. Why, these fans asked, did this particular joke earn a fate that so many wilder moments escaped? Others felt the network had made the right call for a young audience, and that a story built around breaking into a home and stealing underwear simply did not belong on a channel aimed at small children. Adding to the frustration was the fact that a great many viewers actually liked the episode and remembered it fondly. It was not widely regarded as one of the show's worst efforts. Plenty of people recalled it as one of the funnier Mr. Krabs stories, a solid entry from the golden years of the series, which made its disappearance sting all the more. There is a particular kind of loss that comes from watching something you enjoyed and that seemed perfectly fine in its time become quietly forbidden, reclassified as a problem after the fact, with no say given to the people who had loved it. The removal touched that nerve for a lot of longtime fans who felt a small piece of their childhood had been taken away and locked in a drawer of its own. The story of this one segment carries an extra wrinkle that connects it to a far darker thread in the wider world of SpongeBob theories, and it is worth a quiet mention here because it shows how a single short episode can lead two completely separate lives. At one point in this very story, Mr. Krabs takes a bite of a Krabby Patty and remarks, in passing, that that is what he tastes like. The line is plainly meant as a throwaway gag, the kind of joke designed to sail right over a young viewer's head while raising a small smile in any adult half listening from across the room. For most people, it lands and is forgotten in the same instant. For a certain group of fans, though, that single line became a key piece of evidence in a long-running and genuinely unsettling theory about what the famous burgers are secretly secretly made from. The same handful of minutes that became infamous among the people deciding what children should watch also became infamous for an entirely different reason among the people who spend their time digging for hidden meaning in the show. One short segment, two separate reputations, neither of which it was ever built to carry. There is something quietly strange about the whole business of a show hiding its own episodes, and this first case lays the pattern out plainly. A cartoon spends years building an enormous library of stories, then turns around and decides that a small number of them must be locked away, sometimes by the very same company that once aired them with pride and promoted them as part of the fun. Standards do not stand still. A joke that seemed perfectly fine to broadcast in 1 year can read as plainly off limits less than 2 decades later. Even though nothing about the joke itself has changed, the episode stayed exactly as it had always been, frame for frame, while the world's sense of what was acceptable moved on around it and left the segment stranded on the wrong side of a line that had quietly shifted. The removal also belongs to the particular age of streaming, which gives these modern bands a weight that older ones never had. In an earlier time, an episode pulled from television still sat safely on the shelves of every person who owned it on disc, untouched by any decision made in a network office. Today, when so many people only ever watch a show through a streaming service, a quiet removal can come much closer to erasing something completely. What gets taken down can slip out of reach for an entire wave of viewers who have no other copy and no other way to find it. For the children growing up with the show now, this segment simply does not exist in their version of it. It has become a half-remembered rumor, a thing older siblings mention, rather than something they can call up and watch whenever they please. And yet, in the way these things so often go, the banning of the episode probably did more to keep it alive than letting it sit quietly in rotation ever would have. Each time the news reported that a SpongeBob episode had been pulled, curiosity spiked, and people who had never given the old segment a second thought suddenly went hunting for it. A story about something being taken away is, for a great many viewers, an invitation to go and find out what all the fuss was about. The very act of burying the episode dug it back up in the public mind, handing it a second life as forbidden fruit, talked about far more in its exile than it had ever been during all those ordinary years on the afternoon schedule. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A gentle night out had ended with a quietly banned joke and a missing episode, the first of the show's hidden corners. Yet there is one story the network never had to hide because the cruelty inside it aired in full, and it pushed a beloved character toward an act that no children's cartoon was ever supposed to show. Section 2. When a kid's show played a suicide for laughs. Plankton has always been the smallest figure in Bikini Bottom, and in many ways the most pitiable. He runs a failing restaurant directly across the street from the wildly successful one owned by his rival, and almost nothing in his life ever goes the way he hopes. His grand schemes collapse. His one customer wanders off. His wife, a computer, often seems more amused by his failures than moved by them. For most of the show's run, he serves as a kind of lovable loser, a tiny green villain whose constant defeats are part of the comedy. The audience is meant to laugh at him, but rarely to feel that anything truly terrible is happening to him. There is a softness to his suffering that keeps it gentle, the way a cartoon usually keeps even its meanest moments safe. Then came an episode that stripped that softness away, and in doing so, it produced what many longtime fans still regard as the darkest and most genuinely cruel half-hour the series ever made. The episode arrived in the spring of 2010, during the show's 7th season, a stretch of years that a large portion of the audience already viewed with suspicion. It was paired with another short story, in the usual way, and it carried a title that played on the idea of a single meal. The setup begins with a coincidence. During one of Plankton's endless attempts to steal the secret recipe from his rival, he is suddenly frightened off by the appearance of Pearl, the young whale who happens to be Mr. Krabs' daughter. The fright is genuine, and it is severe. Plankton, it turns out, is deeply and helplessly afraid of whales, a fear that runs so deep it can stop him cold and send him fleeing in terror. He is humiliated by his own panic, and he confides the secret of this fear to his wife, hoping for some comfort. What he gets instead sets the whole grim machine in motion. Rather than helping him, the people around him treat his fear as a weakness to be exploited. Mr. Krabs learns of it, and he sees in it the perfect tool to keep his rival away from the restaurant for good. So the crab disguises himself as his own daughter, looming up out of the dark in the shape of the very thing Plankton is most afraid of, and he scares the tiny creature half to death. He does this not once, in a single moment of self-defense, but again and again. He stakes out Plankton's restaurant. He waits for him. He pursues the fear deliberately, returning to torment him over and over until the constant terror begins to do real damage to Plankton's mind. The episode does not flinch from showing what that damage looks like. Plankton stops sleeping properly. He suffers nightmares in which an enormous, monstrous version of Pearl devours him and everyone like him. He grows paranoid and jumpy, afraid to leave his own building, shrinking from a world that has become nothing but a source of dread. The relentless campaign of fear hollows him out scene by scene, and the show lingers on his collapse in a way that feels heavier and more uncomfortable uncomfortable than anything the series usually allows itself. A character who had always bounced back from defeat is shown here genuinely breaking down, and the cause of that breakdown is the deliberate cruelty of another main character whom the audience is meant to like. The moment that turned the episode from merely dark into something fans found almost impossible to forgive comes near its end. Plankton, worn down past the point of bearing it, gives up. He walks out into the road and lies down in the path of an oncoming bus, intending to let it end his suffering. There is no clever misdirection here, no last-second reveal that he was only pretending. The show plainly presents a beloved character lying in the street, waiting to be run over, having decided that he would rather not go on. For a cartoon aimed at children, this was a startling and genuinely disturbing place to go, and it is the single image that has kept the episode infamous ever since. SpongeBob happens upon him in time and talks him back from the road, and for a moment it seems the story might find its way to something kind. SpongeBob is upset by what he has witnessed, and he confronts Mr. Krabs over the way he has treated their rival, making clear that he does not approve of driving anyone to such a state. He even offers Plankton a chance at revenge. The trouble is how the rest of the episode handles all of this. When Plankton, seizing the offer, asks SpongeBob to step on Mr. Krabs as payback, SpongeBob refuses, explaining that such an act would go against his good nature. The line struck many viewers as deeply hollow, given everything SpongeBob has done to other characters across the years, and it left the revenge promise feeling like a trick rather than a kindness. The ending lands the final blow. SpongeBob, having pulled Plankton back from the edge and seemingly taken his side, turns around and frightens him all over again, using a projected image of a whole group of whales to send the terrified creature fleeing once more. The very fear that had nearly destroyed Plankton is weaponized against him one last time, and by the friend who had just saved him. Mr. Krabs, meanwhile, faces no real consequence for any of it. He does not learn a lesson. He is not punished. When he is told that his rival has been driven to such a low and desperate place, his response is to laugh and remark that Plankton is a mess, treating the whole thing as a great joke. The story ends with the cruel character having won completely, and the broken one having gained nothing at all. Watch closely. The episode contains a small detail that many fans found especially chilling. At one point, Mr. Krabs erases a drawing of Plankton, a gesture that, to viewers already disturbed by his behavior, read as something close to a wish to be rid of his rival entirely, to wipe him out of existence. Whether or not that reading was intended, it added to the sense that the episode had pushed a familiar comic villain into territory that felt genuinely menacing. The crab who had once been merely greedy and eccentric now seemed, in this story, to take real pleasure in another creature's destruction. The reaction from the fanbase was swift and harsh, and it has barely faded with time. The episode is routinely named in fan discussions as one of the worst the series ever produced, and for a great many people, it sits at the very bottom of the list. The objections gathered around a few clear points. There was the suicide attempt itself, presented in a children's program and surrounded by jokes. There was the transformation of Mr. Krabs into something that resembled a cruel and remorseless figure rather than the lovable miser audiences had grown up with. There was the absence of any comeuppance, the sense that the show had let its meanest character get away clean, while its most pitiable ones suffered for nothing. And there was SpongeBob's betrayal at the close, which soured the one moment of decency the story had seemed to offer. The anger grew loud enough that fans organized around it in a way they rarely do over a single episode. A petition appeared online calling for the episode to be banned outright, arguing that a story in which a character is tormented to the point of attempting to end his life, with the tormentor escaping all punishment, simply did not belong on a channel made for children. The petition pointed to the way the episode had been received, noting that it was widely deplored by fans and critics alike, and frequently described as among the worst the series had ever made. A children's cartoon episode drawing a formal campaign for its removal is its own small marker of how deeply it had upset the people who loved the show. Part of what made the episode so jarring was the way it broke with what the series had previously established about its own characters. In earlier stories, Mr. Krabs and Plankton had been shown to share a long and complicated history, having once been close friends before their rivalry began. That history made the Krabs' gleeful cruelty here feel like a betrayal of the show's own past, a contradiction that fans were quick to point out. The fear of whales sat awkwardly against continuity too, since Plankton had been shown interacting with Pearl in earlier episodes without any sign of the paralyzing terror this story insisted he had always carried. The series had never been especially careful about continuity, but the gaps here mattered more than usual, because they were being used to justify something genuinely dark. The episode did not appear out of nowhere, and it fits into a larger pattern that troubled fans during this era of the show. Over the years, Mr. Krabs had slowly drifted from an eccentric, money-loving figure into something colder and harder. His greed, once a source of harmless comedy, began to curdle in certain late episodes into genuine selfishness and even cruelty, with stories that showed him willing to hurt the people and creatures around him for the sake of profit or spite. Fans gave this gradual souring its own name, treating it as a kind of slow decay in which a character's single defining trait gets exaggerated exaggerated past the point of likability until very little of the original figure remains. This particular episode was, for many, the lowest point of that decay, the moment where the friendly crabs seemed to vanish entirely and leave something genuinely unpleasant in his place. The show seemed only partly aware of what it had done. The episode was originally to have carried a different title, one that framed Plankton's downfall as a kind of comeuppance he had earned, suggesting that the writers had approached the story as a tale of a deserving villain getting what was coming to him. By that reading, Plankton is a persistent thief and schemer who has menaced the restaurant for years, and his torment is simply payback. Some fans accepted this defense, arguing that the tiny villain had brought his troubles on himself and that the show was within its rights to let him lose badly. The problem for most viewers was one of proportion. Whatever Plankton's crimes, being driven to lie down in a road did not feel like a fitting punishment for a cartoon thief, and watching the supposedly good characters enjoy his suffering made the whole thing curdle rather than satisfy. There is a wider point worth sitting with calmly here, about what it means for a show built on gentle comedy to reach for such heavy material. SpongeBob had always carried a faint streak of darkness beneath its bright surface, a willingness to touch on loneliness, failure, and despair in small doses. Squidward's misery, Plankton's endless defeat, Mr. Krabs' coldness about money, all of these had been part of the texture of the show for years, handled lightly enough that they never overwhelmed the comedy. This episode took that faint streak and dragged it fully into the open, building an entire story around the breaking of a character's mind. For some viewers, that was a brave and interesting choice. For far more of them, it was a line the show should never have crossed, a tonal mistake that left a sour taste no amount of jokes could wash away. The episode also sat alongside another story from the same rough period that touched on similar territory, one in which a pair of jokes briefly suggested that Squidward might be considering ending his own life before pulling back to reveal he was only doing something ordinary. That story too drew complaints, though most fans judged it the lesser offense since it stopped short of showing a genuine attempt and treated the subject as a quick gag rather than the engine of the whole plot. Placed next to each other, the two episodes marked a stretch where the show seemed willing to flirt with very dark ideas in a way it mostly avoided before and after. The one built around Plankton's despair remained the more notorious of the two by a wide margin, precisely because it committed so fully to the darkness rather than backing away from it. What keeps the episode infamous more than any single moment is the gap between what it shows and where it shows it. A small child watching might absorb only the surface, the silly disguises and the chasing and the familiar characters, and miss the weight of what is actually happening. An older viewer, or that same child grown up and watching again, sees it clearly. The cheerful little world of Bikini Bottom, the place built for comfort and laughter, is used here to stage a story about a creature so broken by cruelty that he lies down to die, while the ones responsible laugh it off and walk away unpunished. The show did not change a frame of it after the fact. It was never quietly pulled the way some other episodes were. It simply remains, available to watch, a strange and heavy thing sitting in the middle of an otherwise sunny series, remembered by fans as the moment the gentlest cartoon on television went somewhere it perhaps never should have gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One episode had shown its meanest character winning and its smallest one broken, and the fans never quite forgave it. Yet cruelty was only one of the ways the show learned to upset its audience, because a handful of other episodes set out instead to discuss them, to torment the gentle ones, and to test how much discomfort a children's cartoon could hold. Section 3. The episodes fans could not forgive. There is more than one way for a children's show to upset the people who love it. Cruelty is one way, and the previous chapter showed how far the series could go down that road. Disgust is another, and so is the quiet betrayal of a beloved character's nature. The sense that a figure you trusted has been twisted into someone unrecognizable for the sake of a single story. During one particular stretch of its long life, SpongeBob SquarePants seemed to reach for all of these at once, producing a small cluster of episodes that fans came to regard with a special kind of loathing. None of them were ever pulled from the air. None caused a national headline. Yet within the community of people who had grown up with the show, these stories became infamous. The episodes that get named again and again whenever the question of the series' worst moments comes up. Most of them belong to the same rough period, the 7th season, and the years clustered around it, a stretch many longtime viewers point to as a low ebb in the show's quality. The reasons fans gave varied from one episode to the next, but a few patterns ran through nearly all of them. Characters behaved in ways that contradicted everything the show had established about them. Gentle figures were tormented for laughs, and in a handful of cases, the animation itself turned grotesque, dwelling on images so unpleasant that watching became a genuine test of the stomach. Taken together, these episodes formed a kind of unofficial gallery of everything fans felt had gone wrong with the show in its middle age. The most notorious of the gross ones centers on something as small as a splinter. The story begins simply enough with SpongeBob catching a sliver of wood in his hand during an ordinary day at work. Afraid that an injury will will get him sent home early and that he will lose face in front of his boss, he decides to hide it and deal with it himself. What follows is a slow and deeply unpleasant escalation as the small wound is left untreated and allowed to fester. The animation does not look away. The injury swells and reddens and grows steadily more horrible until it dominates the screen, glistening and infected in a way that pushed far past anything the show had attempted before. Patrick arrives to help, pretending to be a doctor, and his clumsy interference only makes the whole thing worse, dragging out the disgust for as long as the episode can manage. Fans who disliked the episode rarely complained about its story, because there was barely a story to complain about. Their objection was almost entirely about the imagery. The wound was simply too revolting, they argued, lingered on too long, and rendered in too much loving detail, with no real joke or point to justify how sickening it had become. Some viewers reported that the episode genuinely turned their stomachs, that they struggled to sit through it, and that it left them feeling ill rather than amused. A cartoon can use a little grossness as seasoning, the way the show often had with mild slime and goo over the years. This episode, in the eyes of its critics, mistook the seasoning for the meal, building an entire 11 minutes around a single escalating piece of body horror and forgetting to be funny along the way. A second episode from the same era earned its infamy through a very different door, by making its hero behave in a way that fans found almost impossible to accept. The story has SpongeBob bring home a new pet to keep his beloved snail company, ignoring a clear warning from the shopkeeper that the creature is a poor choice. The new pet turns out to be a small monster, and over the course of the episode, it terrorizes the snail relentlessly, hunting him through the house and growing larger and more dangerous as it goes. Throughout all of this, SpongeBob fails to notice or refuses to believe what is happening, brushing off his snail's obvious distress and even blaming the poor creature for the chaos. By the climax, the monster has grown enormous and very nearly devours the snail whole. What enraged fans was the portrayal of SpongeBob himself. In every previous version of the character, his love for his pet snail had been one of his defining and most endearing traits. He understood the snail, he doted on him. The bond between them was treated as genuine and deep. This episode tossed all of that aside, presenting a SpongeBob who ignores his terrified pet's cries for help over and over, even though the show had long established that he can understand exactly what the snail is saying. The hero of the series spends the entire story being willfully blind to a loved one in mortal danger, and the result, for many viewers, was an episode that made them actively dislike the character they had spent years adoring. The snail nearly dies because of SpongeBob's neglect, and the betrayal of his established nature felt, to fans, like a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was supposed to be. A third episode from the cluster drew its anger from a similar source, the warping of a character into someone cruel, this time aimed at SpongeBob himself as the victim. The story sees Patrick accidentally trap SpongeBob inside a piece of laundry equipment, gluing him in place so that he cannot move or do anything for himself. As SpongeBob's life falls apart around him, helpless and stuck, Patrick's attempts to help only deepen the disaster, making everything steadily worse. The breaking point comes when SpongeBob, having lost nearly everything and reduced to misery, finally loses his temper and tells Patrick the plain truth that all of this is Patrick's fault. The episode then does something that fans found genuinely baffling. It treats SpongeBob as the villain of the moment for daring to say so, and it casts Patrick as the wounded innocent, with the rest of the town rallying around Patrick and shaming SpongeBob for his outburst. The logic of the episode struck viewers as not merely weak but backward. A character causes a catastrophe through his own carelessness, refuses to take responsibility, and is then rewarded with sympathy while his victim is blamed for being upset. Fans described the story as one that punished the wrong person and asked the audience to side against common sense. It became a frequent example in discussions of the show's decline, held up as proof that the writing during this period had lost its grip on cause and consequence, on the basic question of who in a story deserves the audience's sympathy. The episode is regularly named among the very worst the series produced, sometimes placed at the absolute bottom, precisely because its central injustice is so hard to look past. Alongside these sat other stories that fans treated as part of the same troubled family. One episode built its comedy around the torment of Squidward by Plankton, who harvests the poor creature's misery and fear in order to make a product, dwelling once again on suffering and a faintly disgusting premise. Another, from a slightly earlier point, contained a single moment so gruesome, involving the painful removal of part of Squidward's body, that it lodged in viewers' memories as one of the most shocking images the show had ever produced, jarring against the cheerful tone around it. These so-called Squidward torture episodes formed their own recognized category of complaint, a long-running thread of stories in which the grumpy neighbor is put through humiliation and pain far past what the comedy seemed to require, until the cruelty stopped being funny and started to feel mean-spirited. The era also produced the episode that touched, lightly, on the same dark subject the previous chapter explored at length. In this story, SpongeBob tries to cheer up a thoroughly miserable Squidward, and along the way the episode plays a pair of jokes that briefly suggest Squidward might be about about to harm himself, before pulling back each time to reveal something harmless. The gags were quick, and the episode stopped well short of showing anything real, which is why most fans judged it far less offensive than the notorious story about Plankton's despair. Still, it drew complaints of its own, with viewers questioning whether such jokes belonged in the show at all, and it added to the growing sense that this stretch of the series was willing to brush up against subject that sat uneasily in a children's cartoon. What ties all of these episodes together, beyond the season they share, is the way they soured the things fans had loved most about the show. The series at its best had been gentle, even in its chaos, fond of its characters, even when laughing at them, careful to keep its meanness playful and its grossness mild. The disliked episodes broke each of those quiet promises in turn. They made the kind hero neglectful, the loyal friend a menace, the comic torment genuinely painful, and the harmless visual humor into something that could turn a stomach. For a generation that had grown up trusting the show to be a safe and warm place, these stories felt like a violation of that trust. Small betrayals scattered through a season that many fans simply chose to skip on rewatches. The anger over these episodes occasionally spilled out into the real world in ways that revealed how seriously people took them. The community of fans who reviewed and dissected the show online turned its attention to the weaker stories, picking them apart in detail, and in at least one instance, the fury aimed at a particular episode spread beyond the episode itself and reached the person who had written it. A well-known critical review of one of these disliked stories indirectly led to the writer being harassed online, hounded over a single episode of a cartoon. The incident stands as an uncomfortable reminder that the passion fans feel for a beloved show has a dark edge, that disappointment can curdle into something genuinely unkind, and that the people who actually make these stories are real and can be hurt by the backlash their work provokes. It is worth holding a fair thought alongside all of this criticism. A show that runs for hundreds upon hundreds of episodes across decades is going to produce weak ones, and judging an entire series by its lowest points would be unfair to everything else it accomplished. The very fact that these particular episodes stand out so sharply is, in a strange way, a measure of how high the show's usual standard was. Fans noticed these stories precisely because they fell so far below what they had come to expect. A lesser cartoon might have produced dozens of forgettable failures that no one bothered to single out. SpongeBob produced a small handful of episodes bad enough to earn lasting infamy, and the rest of its enormous library was strong enough to make those few feel like genuine aberrations rather than the norm. There is also a question of taste and timing tangled up in these judgments. Some of the grossness that fans recoiled from was, in its own way, a continuation of something the show had always done. The series had flirted with the disgusting from its earliest years, and a few of its most celebrated classic episodes contained moments of slime and decay that audiences happily embraced. The difference, critics argued, lay in the balance. The classic episodes had used grossness in service of a strong story and a real joke, while the disliked later ones seemed to reach for it as an end in itself, leaning on shock where the writing had run dry. Whether that distinction holds up perfectly is a matter of opinion, but it captures the heart of why these episodes landed so badly with the people who knew the show best. The strangest feature of this whole cluster is that, unlike the segment buried in the previous chapter, none of these episodes were ever removed or hidden. The network did not pull them. They remain available to watch, sitting quietly in the library among hundreds of better-loved stories, easy to find for anyone who goes looking. Their infamy lives entirely in the memory of the fans, rather than in any official act of censorship. They were judged not by a standards review in a corporate office, but by the audience itself, condemned in forums and comment sections and video reviews, sentenced to a reputation rather than to deletion. In that sense, they represent a different kind of controversy altogether, one driven from the bottom up, where the people who loved the show decided on their own which of its stories had failed them and refused, year after year, to let those failures be forgotten. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A handful of episodes had earned their bad name through disgust and betrayal, condemned by the fans and left in plain sight. Yet one famous scene faced the opposite fate, quietly cut and erased from almost every copy of the show, and for years, almost everyone believed it vanished for a reason that turned out to be wrong. Section 4. The scene they erase. Some pieces of a show disappear so completely that people forget they were ever there at all. An entire episode being pulled is a large and noticeable event, the kind of thing that draws news coverage and fan petitions. A single scene quietly snipped out of an otherwise untouched episode is a much smaller and stranger thing. The episode keeps airing, the story stays the same, only a brief stretch of seconds goes missing, smoothed over so neatly that a casual viewer would never know anything had been removed. SpongeBob SquarePants contains one of the most famous examples of this kind of vanishing, a roughly 40-second sequence that aired exactly once in its full form and was then cut out of nearly every copy of the show that followed, leaving behind a small mystery that fans spent years trying to solve. The episode itself is a beloved one, regularly easily counted among the strongest the series ever made. It comes from the third season that celebrated early stretch, and it tells the story of Squidward and a Krabby Patty. Squidward has spent years refusing to so much as taste the famous burger, holding himself above the food that everyone else in town adores. When he finally tries one, he is overcome, and he develops a desperate, consuming obsession with the thing he had scorned. The obsession drives him to sneak into the restaurant in the dead of night, hungry for more, and it is in this nighttime break-in that the trouble began. In the version that aired first, on a single evening in the autumn of 2001, Squidward's late-night intrusion runs him straight into a security system that Mr. Krabs has installed to keep intruders, and especially plankton, out of the building after hours. The trap is a simple and violent one. A bucket of gasoline sits ready, and when Squidward mistakes it for a harmless bucket of water and spills it across the floor, a match sets the whole thing alight in an explosion that leaves him charred and blackened. The gag does not stop at one blast. It happens a second time, doubling the destruction before the episode moves on. The sequence is loud, fiery, and played entirely for laughs, the kind of cartoon mayhem the show trafficked in regularly. That full version went out to homes only that one time. Within a few months, reports began to surface that the scene had been cut. Viewers who went back to rewatch the episode found that the gasoline sequence was simply gone, replaced by a quick visual jump that skipped straight to Squidward in the kitchen, unharmed and unburned, with no sign that any explosion had ever taken place. The edit was clean enough that someone seeing the episode for the first time in its trimmed form would notice nothing missing. The story flowed on as though the trap had never existed. Only those who had caught that original airing, or who heard about it later, knew that something had been quietly removed. For a very long time, the reason behind the removal was a matter of guesswork, and the explanation that took hold was tied to one of the darkest events in recent memory. The episode had aired in early October of 2001, less than a month after the terrorist attacks of that September. In the aftermath of those attacks, media of every kind was being carefully re-examined, with films and television shows cutting, delaying, or burying anything that resembled the violence the country had just witnessed. A cartoon sequence built around two explosions, arriving in that exact climate, seemed an obvious candidate for quiet removal. Fans pointed to the detail of the doubled blast, drawing an uneasy line between the two explosions in the gag and the two towers that had fallen, and the theory spread until it became the accepted wisdom. The scene, people said, had been cut out of respect for the tragedy. The trouble with that explanation is a simple matter of timing, and it is the detail that kept the mystery alive for years. The episode aired after the attack, not before them. The full gasoline sequence went out to the country with the explosions intact, weeks after September had already happened. If the scene had been considered too painful or too dangerous in the wake of the tragedy, the most natural moment to remove it would have been before that first airing, not several months afterward. The fact that the network let the scene broadcast in full during the most raw and sensitive period, only to cut it later once the immediate shock had begun to fade, sat awkwardly against the idea that the attacks alone were the cause. Something about the popular story did not quite add up, and careful fans noticed. A clearer picture eventually emerged, and it came from the people who had actually made the show. Years after the cut, one of the writers responsible for the episode spoke about it directly, explaining that the original version had gone through every level of approval the network required before it ever aired. The scene had been checked, rechecked, and signed off on as acceptable, and it had been broadcast in full with the company's blessing. He acknowledged that the events of that September had been a significant factor in the later decision to remove it, but he tied that decision to a broader concern about standards rather than to grief alone. The attacks had changed the climate, and in that changed climate, a gag that had already passed every test was looked at again with newer, more cautious eyes. The fullest explanation arrived later still, from the person who would go on to run the show for many years. He stated plainly that the removal had come down to a standards issue, and specifically to the network's discomfort with a gag built around a match and a bucket of gasoline. The worry, in this telling, was about imitation. A child watching a beloved cartoon might see a character spill gasoline and set it alight, and the fear was that some young viewer might try to copy the stunt at home with real and terrible consequences. Cartoons aimed at children have long operated under rules about so-called repeatable behavior, the idea that any dangerous action shown on screen must be one that a child could not easily reproduce. A bucket of gasoline and a match sitting in an ordinary doorway was, by this reasoning, exactly the kind of thing a curious child might be able to recreate, and that made it a problem. This explanation reframed the whole affair. The attacks of that September had not been the sole reason for the cut, so much as the moment that prompted a second look. In the heightened caution of that period, the network reviewed material it might otherwise have left alone, and when it re-examined this particular gag through that more careful lens, it decided the gasoline trap failed the standard it should have been held to all along. The popular theory and the real reason were tangled together rather than opposed. The tragedy created the climate of review, and the review caught a gag that the network came to believe had been a mistake to broadcast in the first place, on grounds of safety rather than sensitivity. There is a small piece of evidence for the imitation explanation buried in the show's own later history. Years afterward, the series used a gag involving a match and gasoline once again, in the climax of a much later episode, without any apparent problem. When fans asked the showrunner about the apparent contradiction, why one gasoline gag had been erased while another was allowed to stand, he drew a careful distinction. The difference, he explained, lay in whether a child could copy it. A bucket of gasoline placed over a doorway is something a real child could imitate. An enormous container of gas the size of a parade float is not. The concern had never been about gasoline in the abstract. It had been about whether the specific image taught a small viewer something dangerous they could actually attempt, and the doorway trap fell on the wrong side of that line, in a way the later gag did not. The removal was never complete, which is part of what kept the scene alive in the minds of fans. The edit was applied to airings within the United States and certain other countries, but elsewhere the full version continued to play. Some foreign broadcasts, including ones recorded early in the show's life, kept the gasoline sequence intact, and viewers in those regions grew up with a version of the episode that audiences at home had never seen in full. A few translated editions, dubbed before the cut took hold, preserved the scene as well. For a long stretch, the surest way to see the original gag was to seek out a broadcast from another country, where the standards that had erased it at home simply did not apply. At home, by contrast, the scene became something close to lost media, the term fans use for footage that once existed and aired but has since become genuinely hard to find. The cut version was the one released on disc, the one that played in reruns, and later the one that appeared on streaming, while the original sequence survived mostly in scattered recordings made by fans who had captured that early airing before the change. People traded those recordings, uploaded the missing 40 seconds on their own, and treated the hunt for the unedited episode as a small quest. A piece of a famous episode had slipped out of the official record, surviving only in the hands of people determined not to let it disappear, which is exactly the pattern that turns an ordinary deleted scene into a long-running fascination. The scene's afterlife took an ironic turn, because the very act of cutting it helped make it famous. Had the gasoline gag simply remained in the episode like any other joke, it might have passed unremarked, one piece of cartoon chaos among thousands. Its removal gave it a mystique it never would have earned otherwise. Fans who learned that a scene had been erased naturally wanted to see the thing that had been taken away, and the missing footage became an object of curiosity far out of proportion to its actual content. The sequence went on to circulate widely online, and even became a small internet phenomenon, quoted and shared and dissected, kept alive precisely because someone had tried to make it go away. The burying of the scene dug it back up, the same strange effect that has followed so many of the show's hidden corners. What makes this case quieter and gentler than the cruelties of earlier chapters is that nothing about the decision was malicious or mean-spirited. There was no character being tormented, no story curdling into something ugly. The episode itself remained whole and beloved, untouched in every part except for one brief and genuinely dangerous-looking gag. The network's choice, once its real reasoning came to light, looked less like censorship of an idea and more like a careful parent quietly removing a hazard from a child's reach. A bucket of gasoline and a lit mat, presented as comedy to an audience full of small children, was the kind of thing a cautious company might reasonably decide it did not want to model, however funny the gag had seemed in the writer's room. The lasting interest in the scene says something about how closely the show's audience watches, and how long memories run among the people who grew up with it. A 40-second sequence, cut from a single episode more than 2 decades ago, still draws discussion and debate, still gets explained and re-explained as new information surfaces from the people who made it. The mistaken belief about the tragedy, the slow arrival of the real reason, the distinction between imitable and non-imitable gags, all of it has been turned over again and again by a fan base that refuses to let even the smallest piece of its childhood fade quietly into the dark. A show watched by hundreds of millions ends up with hundreds of millions of pairs of eyes on it, and some of those eyes never stop looking, even at the spaces where something used to be. The episode stands now as a small lesson in how easily the record of a show can shift beneath everyone's feet. The version most people watch today is missing something the original audience saw, smoothed over so cleanly that the absence is invisible unless you know to look for it. The story everyone believed about why it vanished turned out to be partly wrong, corrected only years later by the people who had been in the room. And the scene itself, meant to be quietly forgotten, became one of the most talked about pieces of footage the show ever produced, kept alive by the very effort to erase it. A gentle cartoon about a sea sponge had managed, almost by accident, to create a genuine little mystery, one that took the better part of 20 years to fully untangle. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single dangerous gag had slipped out of the record, erased for reasons the audience took years to understand. Yet the deepest complaint fans ever made was not about one scene or one episode at all, but about a slow change in the whole show, a quiet souring that many felt had crept in and never fully left. Section 5. The slow souring of Bikini Bottom. The worst thing that can happen to a beloved show is rarely a single bad episode. A bad episode is an event, sharp and contained, easy to point at and easy to skip. What fans find far harder to bear is something slower and harder to name, a gradual drift in which the thing they loved seems to lose its way, one small step at a time, until one day they look up and realize the show no longer feels the way it used to. SpongeBob SquarePants lived long enough to suffer exactly this kind of slow change, and the complaint about it became one of the largest and longest-running grievances the fan base ever held. It was not aimed at any one story, but at the whole shape of the series as it aged, at a souring that many viewers felt had crept into Bikini Bottom and settled there. To understand the complaint, a person first has to understand a turning point that the show's own creator intended as an ending. In 2004, the series released its first feature film, a big-screen adventure that wrapped up the world of the show in a way that felt deliberate and complete. For Steven Hillenburg, the man who had built the entire thing, that movie was meant to be the finish line. He had poured years into the series, had guided its tone and its heart from the beginning, and he saw the film as a natural and satisfying place to set the whole story down for good. In his mind, the journey had reached its proper end, and the cheerful little world he had made could rest there, whole and intact. The company that owned the show felt very differently. SpongeBob, by that point, had grown into one of the most valuable properties in all of children's entertainment, a giant that sold mountains of merchandise and drew enormous audiences across the world. A property that large and that profitable almost never gets allowed to simply stop. So the show continued, and Hillenburg, who had intended to walk away, stepped back from the daily running of it rather than oversee a continuation he had not planned for. The series rolled onward under the guidance of other talented people, but without the steady hand of the man whose specific sensibility had shaped everything that came before. The split between his vision and the company's appetite for more would echo through everything that followed. It is in the seasons after that first movie that fans located the beginning of the decline. The change was not sudden, and it was not total, which is part of why it took so long to name. The show remained recognizably itself. The characters were the same, the setting was the same, the basic comedy was the same. Yet something in the texture of it shifted, and viewers who had grown up on the earlier seasons began to feel that the warmth had thinned and the cleverness had coarsened. Jokes that once arose naturally from character and situation seemed increasingly to be reaching for shock or grossness instead. Stories that had once balanced silliness with genuine heart leaned harder on chaos and noise. The gentle affection the show had always shown its characters started, in certain episodes, to give way to something harsher. The clearest and most discussed symptom of this drift had a name that fans borrowed from the wider world of television criticism. The term describes what happens when a character is slowly reduced to a single exaggerated trait, when the rich and rounded figure of the early years gets sanded down until only one quality remains, cranked up past the point of believability. The idea is that a character who was once defined by many things becomes, over time, a walking version of just one thing, and usually one of their less flattering ones. SpongeBob suffered this fate across several of its central figures, and watching it happen became one of the chief sorrows of the show's longtime audience. Mr. Krabs offered the most painful example, the one fans returned to again and again. In the early seasons, the crab had been an eccentric and complicated figure. His love of money was real and constant, but it sat alongside other things: a genuine, if rough, affection for SpongeBob, a deep love for his daughter, a history, and a personality that made him more than a single joke. As the years passed, that complexity drained away, and what remained was greed alone, pushed further and further until it curdled into something cold. Later episodes showed him willing to mistreat the people and creatures around him for the sake of a coin, to put his employees in danger, to value profit above any bond or decency. The friendly miser of the early years became, in his worst appearances, a figure who seemed almost cruel, and the episode explored in an earlier chapter, in which he torments his rival without mercy or consequence, stood as the grim endpoint of that long slide. Patrick underwent a similar and equally lamented transformation. The early version of the character had been innocent above all else, a sweet and simple soul whose stupidity was endearing precisely because it came without any malice. He meant no harm. His foolishness flowed from a kind of pure, childlike vacancy that made him impossible to dislike. Over time, fans argued, that innocence hardened into something meaner. The later Patrick could be selfish, oblivious to others' feelings in a way that tipped past sweetness into genuine inconsiderateness, even outright unkind. Episodes appeared in which his behavior toward his supposed best friend was difficult to read as anything but jerkish, and the gentle simpleton of the golden years seemed to have been replaced by someone whose stupidity now carried a sour edge. The episode in which he traps SpongeBob and is then treated as the wronged party, examined earlier, was for many the worst expression of this change. Even SpongeBob himself did not escape the complaint. The hero of the show had always been enthusiastic, but in the early seasons, that enthusiasm was tempered by sincerity and a real inner life. He was earnest, hopeful, capable of quiet sadness, and genuine kindness. A fully felt character whose optimism meant something because it sometimes cost him. In certain later episodes, fans felt that fullness gave way to a flatter version, a SpongeBob who was simply loud and hyperactive, his cheer dialed up so high that it became grating rather than charming. The character who had once been the warm and beating heart of the show risked becoming, in his weakest appearances, an exhausting bundle of noise, all energy and no soul. Not every fan agreed that this happened, and many episodes still showed the old SpongeBob intact, but the worry was real and widely shared. Alongside these changes came a broader shift in the show's relationship with its grumpiest resident. The pattern of episodes built around the suffering of Squidward, touched on in an earlier chapter, grew more frequent in the post-movie years. The character had always been a figure of comic misery, but the later show seemed increasingly willing to put him through genuine humiliation and pain, to make his torment the engine of stories rather than a gentle running joke. Fans who had once laughed at Squidward's bad luck began to feel uncomfortable with how relentlessly the show seemed to punish him, and the rise of these so-called torture episodes became another thread in the larger tapestry of complaint about where the series had gone. The low point of the whole decline, by broad fan agreement, fell around the 7th season, the stretch that produced the cluster of reviled episodes examined earlier. It was here that the souring seemed to reach its deepest, where the cruelty, the grossness, and the warping of characters all came together in their most concentrated form. For many longtime viewers, this season marked the bottom of the show's long fall, the point at which the gap between what the series had been and what it had become felt widest and most painful. Whether any single season can truly be called the worst is, of course, a matter of opinion, and fans argue endlessly over exactly which episodes and which years deserve the title. But the rough consensus settled on this era as the darkest valley in the show's journey. It would be unfair, and also untrue, to suggest that the show simply collapsed and never recovered. The story of SpongeBob's middle age has a hopeful second half, and it is tied once again to the man who made it. Years after stepping back, Hillenburg returned to take a more active role in his creation, drawn back to the strange and sunny world he had never quite been able to leave behind. He helped guide a second feature film and resumed a closer involvement with the series itself. Many fans felt the difference. The seasons that followed his return were widely seen as a recovery, a partial return to the heart and craft of the early years, with stories that felt warmer and more careful than the worst of the post-movie slump. The decline, in other words, was not a straight line down, but a dip, a troubled middle stretch bracketed by stronger years on either side. This more complicated picture matters because the popular story of the show's decline can flatten into something simpler and harsher than the truth. The version that circulates most loudly holds that the show was brilliant for 3 seasons and then bad forever after, a clean and total fall from grace. The reality was messier and kinder than that. The post-movie years contained genuine failures, the reviled episodes were real and earned their reputation, and the souring of the characters was something fans did not imagine. But those same years also contained good episodes, and the later return to form produced stretches that many viewers placed among the show's better work. A series that runs for decades cannot be summed up by its worst patch any more than by its best, and the honest account holds both the dip and the recovery together. There is also a quieter truth underneath the whole complaint, one that has more to do with the audience than with the show. A great deal of the perceived decline lived in the eyes of viewers who had grown up. The people who loved the early seasons most fiercely were children when those seasons aired, and they carried the memory of that first encounter, golden and uncomplicated, into adulthood. When they returned to the show years later and found it different, some of that difference was real, and some of it was simply the gap between a child's wonder and an adult's harder gaze. The early episodes had landed on minds that were open and easily delighted. The later ones landed on minds that had grown critical and protective and prone to comparison. Disentangling how much the show actually changed from how much the audience changed is nearly impossible, and the truth surely contains a measure of both. The complaint about the decline became, over the years, a permanent feature of how the show was discussed. A whole vocabulary grew up around it, a shorthand that fans used to sort the series into eras, the classic years against the modern ones, the golden age against the fall. Online communities argued endlessly over where exactly the line should be drawn, which season marked the turn, which episodes counted as the last good ones. The discussion became a kind of ritual, a way for a generation to process the strange experience of watching something they love grow old alongside them. Few cartoons inspire this depth of ongoing debate about their own quality, and the very intensity of the argument was, in its odd way, a measure of how much the show still mattered to the people having it. What gives the whole story its quiet weight is the figure standing at the center of it, the creator whose intentions kept echoing through every twist. Hillenburg had wanted the show to end while it was still whole. The company had wanted it to continue forever. The years between those two desires produced both the decline that fans mourned and the recovery that partly redeemed it, and the tension between the artist's wish to protect his creation and the business's hunger to extend it ran plan underneath everything. The souring of Bikini Bottom was, in a sense, the sound of a show being asked to live longer than its maker had planned for it, stretched past the natural ending he had imagined, and forced to keep going, for better and for worse, long after the story he meant to tell had already reached its close. That tension between the man who made the show and the company that owned it would not stay confined to questions of quality and tone. It would surface again, later and louder, in fights over how to treat his memory and his wishes after he was gone. But before any of that, before the grief and the disputes that followed his death, the show would find itself caught up in a very different kind of trouble, one that had nothing to do with bad episodes or souring characters. For a few strange weeks, the cheerful little sponge would be pulled out of his sunny world entirely and dropped into the middle of a national argument among adults who had never set foot in Bikini Bottom, an argument about what he secretly stood for and what he might be teaching the children who love him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The slow decline had been a quarrel among fans, a sorrow felt by the people who loved the show most. Yet the loudest trouble of all came from far outside Bikini Bottom, when one of the most powerful voices in the country stood before an important crowd and warned that the gentle sponge was carrying a hidden message into the homes of children. Section 6. The day a sponge became a culture war. By the start of 2005, SpongeBob SquarePants had grown into something much larger than a cartoon. The show was a phenomenon. It drew enormous numbers of young viewers, sold mountains of toys, and turned its cheerful yellow star into one of the most recognized faces in the country. The character belonged to children first, but plenty of teenagers and adults had embraced him too, and he had become about as widely adored and as plainly harmless a figure as popular culture could produce. All of which made it genuinely strange when, for a few weeks that winter, the little sponge found himself at the center of a serious national argument among grown adults, most of whom had never spent a moment in Bikini Bottom and had no quarrel with the show itself. The man who set the whole thing in motion was, at the time, one of the most influential religious voices in America. He had founded a large and powerful organization focused on family and faith, and millions of people listened to what he had to say about questions of right and wrong, of raising children, and of the direction the country was heading. When a figure of that reach spoke, news outlets across the nation took notice, and his words carried weight far beyond any single room. In January of that year, he stood up at a formal black-tie dinner held in Washington to celebrate the president's recent re-election, an event attended by members of Congress, and during his remarks, he raised an alarm about a children's video. Among the things he singled out was SpongeBob. His warning to that room of lawmakers framed a cartoon sing-along as something parents ought to be worried about. He suggested that the sponge was being used as part of a project that, in his view, was pushing a message about acceptance of homosexuality onto young school children. To an audience of powerful adults gathered for a political celebration, he presented a piece of children's entertainment as a quiet threat, a vehicle for ideas he believed families should be on guard against. The claim, coming from someone of his stature in such a setting, was always going to travel, and travel it did, racing into headlines across the country within days. The video he was actually concerned about had little to do with the SpongeBob show itself. It was a music video built around an old and famous song about family and togetherness, and it featured around 100 well-known cartoon characters drawn from many different programs, all singing the same tune together. SpongeBob was simply one face in a very large and crowded chorus, sharing the screen with characters from a wide range of beloved children's shows. The project came from a foundation started by the musician who had co-written that song decades earlier, an organization he had built in the aftermath of the attacks of that September, with the stated aim of teaching children to get along with people who were different from themselves. The plan behind the video was ambitious in scale. The foundation intended to send it, along with a guide for teachers, to tens of thousands of elementary schools across the country, with a goal of reaching tens of thousands of them in the spring of that year. The aim, as the group described it, was to help young children learn about kindness, respect, and accepting others, the sort of gentle lesson that sounds entirely uncontroversial on its face. A video of cartoon characters singing about family, paired with a classroom guide about being nice to people, did not seem, on the surface, like the kind of thing that could ignite a national fight. The concern, it turned out, did not come from the video at all, a detail that often gets lost in how the episode is remembered. It traced back instead to the foundation's website, where visitors could take a pledge. The pledge asked people to promise to respect others whose beliefs, background, race, or sexual identity differed from their own. Those few words about sexual identity were the spark that set everything alight. Critics seized on that single line, arguing that a project aimed at children should not be linked, even indirectly, to a pledge that touched on such matters, and from that small starting point the whole controversy grew. The pledge had not even originated with the foundation. It came from a separate organization that worked against hate and bigotry, and it had been adapted for the foundation's use. The musician behind the song and the foundation pushed back firmly. He pointed out that the video and the classroom materials never actually mentioned anything about sexual orientation at all, that the song and the lessons were about getting along, with no hidden message tucked inside them. He even offered a possible explanation for the confusion, suggesting that his critic might have mixed up his foundation with a completely different organization that happened to share a similar name and that worked specifically to support young people who were gay. Two groups, similar names, very different missions, and a great deal of misunderstanding in the space between them. By his account, the alarm had been raised over a connection that simply was not there in the way it had been described. Those who supported the original warning pointed to the show itself for evidence, and a couple of small details from the cartoon were pulled into the debate. SpongeBob and Patrick are often shown holding hands as they bounce around together, in the easy, thoughtless way that small children hold hands without meaning anything by it. The pair also love watching their favorite program within the show, a campy series about an aging superhero and his sidekick. These harmless moments were held up by some as hints of something more, as evidence that the sponge was not quite as innocent as he appeared. To most observers, these readings seemed like a stretch, finding hidden meaning in the ordinary gestures of a children's cartoon, but they became part of the conversation all the same. There was a reason SpongeBob, of all the many characters in that crowded video, became the name in every headline. By this point, he had already, separately and on his own, become a kind of affectionate symbol within the gay community. His gentleness, his open heart, the easy warmth between him and Patrick, all of it had led some people to feel a fond connection to the character, to embrace him as a figure they identified with. None of this came from any plan inside the show. It had simply grown up around the character organically, the way these things sometimes do. But it meant that when a fight like this one broke out, the sponge was already sitting in a spot where it could land directly on him, the one face in the chorus most likely to draw the spotlight. The show's own creator had, as it happened, already addressed the question of the character's sexuality before this storm ever broke, and he would address it again during it. He had said that he thought of SpongeBob and Patrick as close friends and nothing more, describing the characters as having no romantic dimension at all. In his eyes, the sponge was neither gay nor straight, because that kind of relationship had simply never been part of who the character was meant to be. He used the word almost asexual to describe how he saw them, explaining that romance had nothing to do with what the show was trying to do. The man who had built SpongeBob had, from his point of view, settled the matter plainly, long before strangers turned it into a public battle, and long after. The controversy had not even sprung up entirely from nowhere. Months before the dinner speech, a writer connected to another conservative group had already argued that the same Tolerance Project carried a hidden message in favor of homosexuality beneath its friendly surface. The idea was already drifting around in certain circles when the more famous warning gave it a vastly larger stage. The remarks at the Washington dinner did not invent the complaint so much as amplify it, taking a small and quiet grievance and blowing it up into front-page news overnight, carried by the weight and reach of the person who voiced it. The reaction came fast and hard, and much of it ran against the warning. Newspapers, television hosts, and writers all across the country responded, and many of them painted the whole affair as an overreach, portraying the alarm over a beloved children's character as narrow-minded and out of touch. The image of a powerful adult sounding the alarm about SpongeBob struck a great many people as faintly absurd, the kind of thing that was almost funny before it became, to its critics, genuinely troubling. For several days, the sponge was everywhere in the news, not for anything the show had done, but for what other people insisted he secretly represented. A cartoon built for small children had become, briefly, a fixture of the adult news cycle. Within days, the figure at the center of it moved to walk the whole thing back. He went on television and said that he had been misquoted and treated unfairly, insisting that he had never once claimed SpongeBob himself was gay. His real complaint, he explained, had always been aimed at the foundation's website and its pledge, not at the cartoon sponge. He maintained that the press had twisted his words, that virtually every newspaper in the country had reported him as saying something he had not actually said. Whether people accepted that clarification depended largely on what they already thought of him, and the argument over what he had truly meant rolled on for a while even after he tried to settle it. What the whole episode revealed had, in the end, less to do with SpongeBob than with the moment the country was living through. The year sat in the middle of a tense and loud national argument over exactly these kinds of questions, a period when feelings on all sides ran high and the culture seemed to be fighting constantly over the place of such matters in public life. A cheerful, gentle cartoon turned out to be the perfect blank surface for adults to argue over, precisely because almost everyone already had warm feelings about him, and almost no one could agree on what those feelings ought to mean. The sponge became a screen onto which very different people projected very different hopes and fears. A neutral and beloved figure dragged into a fight that was never really about him at all. The strangest part of the whole affair, for the actual children watching the show, is that most of them never knew any of it was happening. Kids kept tuning in for the burgers and the jellyfishing and the laughs, completely unaware that their favorite character was the subject of speeches in Washington and shouting matches on the news. The show carried on exactly as before. No episode ever mentioned the fight. SpongeBob SpongeBob himself stayed as sunny and oblivious as ever, flipping patties in his pineapple, while far above the surface, grown adults argued over what he stood for. The gap between the calm of the cartoon and the noise of the controversy could hardly have been wider. The episode left no mark on the show itself, but it marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat in different forms over the years. Again and again, people would pour meaning into a friendly, simple surface, filling the sponge with ideas he never carried on his own. Here that meaning came from some of the most powerful adults in the country, voiced in front of cameras and lawmakers, with real stakes attached to a real lesson meant for real schools. The cartoon stayed silent in the middle of it, the way it always did, and let everyone else do the talking. It would not be the last time that strangers from far outside Bikini Bottom decided that the cheerful little show was secretly doing something to the children who loved it, and the next group to make that case would arrive armed not with sermons but with science. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A preacher and a pledge had turned the sponge into a battleground for a few strange weeks. Then the storm passed and the show sailed on untouched. Yet a few years later, a very different challenge arrived, carried not by faith or politics, but by researchers with a stopwatch, who claimed the show itself might be quietly reshaping young minds. Section 7. The study that put SpongeBob on trial. The thing that made SpongeBob SquarePants so lively was always its speed. The show moves fast and has from the beginning. Scenes flip from one place to another in the blink of an eye. Jokes pile on top of jokes. A single minute of the show can race through a whole handful of different gags, settings, and sudden surprises, never lingering long on any one thing before snapping ahead to the next. That breakneck pace is a large part of what gives the series its energy, the sense that anything might happen at any second. It is also, as a team of researchers came to suspect, exactly the feature that might carry a hidden cost for the youngest viewers. And in 2011, that suspicion became the basis of a study that briefly put the beloved show on trial. The challenge this time came from a place of unusual authority. The earlier storm, explored in the previous chapter, had been driven by faith and politics, by a powerful voice raising a moral alarm. This new worry came from scientists, people armed with a controlled experiment and a respected medical journal, who cared nothing for the sponge's friendships or his supposed hidden messages. Their concern was simpler and, to many parents, far more frightening. They wondered whether the simple act of watching the show might be quietly changing the way young children's brains work, at least for a little while, in ways that could matter. The work was led by a psychologist at a major university who studies how young minds grow and learn, working alongside a colleague. Their findings were published in a journal devoted to the health of children, which gave the study a weight and a seriousness that ordinary commentary about cartoons never carries. The question they set out to answer was direct. They wanted to know whether watching a fast-paced cartoon, even for a short stretch, changed a young child's ability to pay attention, to remember things, to solve small puzzles, and to hold back from acting on every impulse. Those abilities, taken together, are the skills that help a young child sit still, listen, and learn in a classroom, and they are still very new and fragile in a child of only a few years old. The way they set up the test was clean and easy to follow. They gathered 60 children, all 4 years old, and split them at random into 3 even groups of 20. One group sat and watched 9 minutes of SpongeBob. A second group watched 9 minutes of a slower, calmer cartoon made for public television, a gentle program about the everyday life of a small boy. The third group did not watch any television at all, and instead spent those same 9 minutes drawing freely with markers and crayons. 3 groups, the same short stretch of time, 3 very different experiences. The design let the researchers compare a fast show, a slow show, and no show at all, side by side. The reason those 2 particular cartoons were chosen came down to a single measurable difference: the rate at which each show changes scenes. SpongeBob, by their count, switches from one scene to another roughly every 11 seconds. The slower show changed scenes only about twice a minute, giving young viewers far longer to settle into each moment before anything new arrived. One group was fed a steady blast of rapid change, while the other received a calm and unhurried stream. The contrast between the two was the whole point, a way to isolate the effect of pace itself rather than of television in general. After the 9 minutes were up, every child sat down for a set of small mental tasks. Some were puzzles meant to test problem solving. One measured patience directly by placing a tempting snack in front of a child and asking the child to wait, without eating it, until a grown-up returned to the room. These little games were designed to reveal how well each child could focus, think clearly, and resist a tempting urge in the moments right after their 9 minutes had ended. The tasks were ordinary enough that any young child might face something like them in a classroom, which was exactly the point. The researchers wanted to measure the kind of self-control that real school demands. The results pointed sharply in one direction. The children who had watched SpongeBob performed clearly worse on the task than either of the other 2 groups. On the problem-solving test, roughly 7 in 10 of the children who had been drawing passed, a smaller share of those who had watched the slow cartoon passed, and only a small handful of the fast cartoon watchers managed it. On the patience test, the children who had had watched the slower show and the ones who had drawn held out for around 4 minutes before touching the snack, while the SpongeBob group caved after roughly 2.5. Across the different measures, the fast cartoon group looked scattered and worn down compared to the others, as though the rapid viewing had left them less able to gather themselves. What the findings seemed to suggest was that a young child's mind could be tired out, at least briefly, by the effort of keeping up with so much rapid change. A 4-year-old brain is still very new at the work of focusing and waiting. Hit it with a flood of fast cuts and constant surprises, the thinking went, and it spends so much of its energy chasing the action that little is left over for the careful, patient thinking the tests demanded. The show had never been built to be educational in that particular way, and the very speed that made it entertaining might also be leaving little minds momentarily frazzled and unsettled. The study did not claim the effect was permanent. It claimed only that, in the moments right afterward, something measurable had shifted. A small but telling detail is that the study never actually printed the name SpongeBob anywhere in its pages. The researchers described the show instead, calling it a very popular fantastical cartoon about an animated sponge that lives under the sea. Anyone reading it knew at once which show was meant, and the news reports filled in the name immediately. But the careful wording revealed something about the scientists' intent. They were studying a type of fast-paced television rather than picking a fight with one specific cartoon. The sponge simply happened to be the most famous example of the rapid style they wanted to test, the obvious choice precisely because so many young children were watching it. Alongside the study, a children's health expert wrote a short companion piece, and his point widened the conversation in a useful way. He argued that the real lesson for parents was about quality, not just quantity. How long a child watches television matters, he allowed, but what they watch matters at least as much. Fast and frantic shows, he suggested, may simply be a poor fit for the youngest viewers, whose brains are not yet ready for that much speed. He put the idea in plain terms that stuck with people, saying he would not encourage a young child to watch a show like that right before sitting down for an important task that demanded a clear and focused head. The advice was modest, aimed at timing and matching, rather than at banning anything, but it landed hard. The lead researcher offered her own blunt suggestion as well. She advised that parents might think twice before letting very young children watch this kind of fast cartoon in the moments when focus would soon be needed, such as on the way to school. Her warning was narrow in scope, concerned more with when a child watched than with whether they watched at all. But it landed in headlines stripped of all its careful edges. The takeaway that spread fastest was a simple and frightening one, that the beloved sponge could be bad for a child's brain, and that scary version traveled far faster and far wider than the cautious reality behind it. The worry tapped into something that was already gnawing at parents of that era. Screens were multiplying in every home, children were starting to watch television younger and younger, and a low hum of anxiety surrounded the whole question of what all that screen time was doing to growing minds. A study that seemed to show real, measurable harm after only 9 minutes of viewing hit that nerve squarely. For a great many families, the finding turned a harmless afternoon cartoon into a fresh source of guilt and second-guessing. One more thing to worry about in a culture already awash in worries about children and devices. The pushback, though, came quickly and carried real force, and it was not easy to wave away. The company behind the show challenged the study head-on. A spokesman pointed out that the children tested had been 4 years old, while the show had always been made for an older crowd, roughly the 6 to 11 range. Testing the program on children years younger than its intended audience, the company argued, was like judging a chapter book by reading it aloud to toddlers and then declaring the book too difficult. The complaint carried a fair amount of common sense. A show built for older children might reasonably overwhelm a 4-year-old without that telling anyone much about how it affected the kids it was actually made for. The deeper problems with the study were ones the researchers themselves were honest about, which is worth saying plainly. 60 children is a small number to begin with, and split into 3 groups it meant only 20 children watched each thing, a tiny sample on which to build any large claim. The children were also drawn from fairly similar backgrounds rather than a broad and varied mix, so they did not represent all kinds of kids everywhere. The test ran for only 9 minutes, nowhere near how children actually watch television in real life, where viewing often stretches across hours. And, crucially, the study never checked how long the effects lasted. The scattered feeling the researchers measured might have worn off within minutes, the way anyone feels a little jangled after something fast and loud, and then settles back to normal soon after. The fair conclusion sits somewhere in the calm middle, away from both the frightening headlines and the dismissive responses. The study was real, conducted by serious people, and published in a respected place, and it found a genuine short-term difference worth thinking about. At the same time, it was one small experiment, not solid proof that the show causes any lasting harm. It could not honestly carry the weight of the scary stories stacked on top of it, and treating a single modest study as settled fact would have been a mistake in either direction. What the study did well, and what it deserves real credit for, was kicking off a much larger and more useful conversation. One about pace, about screens, and about matching what young children watch to what their developing minds are ready to handle. The whole affair there rhymed with what had come before, even as its tools were completely different. Once again, a gentle and friendly show found itself accused of secretly doing harm to the very children who loved it. The accusation a few years earlier had been about morals and hidden messages delivered from a dinner stage to a room full of lawmakers. This one was about brains and attention, delivered from a research laboratory with charts and numbers and the authority of science. Different worry, different accusers, the same beloved sponge sitting in the middle of it all. And as always, the show itself did not change a single frame in response. It kept right on racing from joke to joke at its usual breakneck speed, indifferent to the debate swirling around it. There is a generational thread running underneath the story too, one that reaches well past any single experiment. The children studied that year belonged to a wave of kids being raised on faster and faster media, with shows, games, and devices all training young eyes to expect constant motion and instant change. The argument over whether that speed was harmless fun or a quiet problem was never really settled by one small study. It grew instead into a question that has followed every new generation of fast entertainment since, long after this particular experiment faded from the news. SpongeBob simply became the famous face attached to a worry far bigger than any single cartoon, the recognizable symbol of an anxiety that was really about the whole shape of modern childhood. The show was put on trial, in a sense, for a change that was happening everywhere, and the verdict, in the end, was the same uneasy uncertainty that still surrounds the question today. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Scientists had measured the sponge against a stopwatch and left parents uneasy about what 9 minutes might do. Yet a still stranger accusation waited a few years off when a scholar looked at the cheerful little town and saw not harmless fun, but the buried history of a real place and the real people who lost it. Section 8. A town built on a bomb. The name of the town where SpongeBob lives is one of those things that sits in plain sight for years without anyone stopping to ask where it came from. Bikini Bottom. It sounds like pure nonsense, a silly and cheerful pairing of words chosen to make children laugh, perfectly suited to a show about a square yellow sponge living beneath the waves. For most of the audience, that is all it has ever been, a bright and meaningless label on a bright and friendly place. But the name is not meaningless at all, and in 2019, around the time the show was celebrating 2 decades on the air, a scholar pointed at that name and argued that it carried the weight of one of the darkest true stories of the last 100 years. Her argument set off a fierce public fight, and it forced a great many people to learn, for the first time, what the cheerful name had quietly been resting on all along. To understand the argument, a person first has to know about a real place. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, scattered across an enormous stretch of water, lies a nation called the Marshall Islands, and within it sits a ring of small, low islands curled around a calm central lagoon. The outside world came to call this ring Bikini Atoll, an altered spelling of the islanders' own older name for their home. People had lived there for thousands of years, fishing the lagoon, living off the sea and the coconut palms, building a culture and a way of life passed down through countless generations. It was, by every measure, a home, settled and loved long before any stranger ever pointed a camera or a weapon at it. Then, in the years after the Second World War, that quiet place was turned into a testing ground for the most terrible weapons ever made. The United States carried out a long series of nuclear tests at the atoll, more than 20 of them across roughly a decade, some of them among the most powerful explosions human beings have ever set off. Before the testing could begin, the people who actually lived there had to be removed. They were gathered together and told that their home was needed for the good of mankind and the ending of all future wars, and they agreed to leave, trusting a promise that they would one day be allowed to return. That promise was never truly kept. The islanders were moved from place to place, suffered hunger on islands that could not support them, and when some were eventually allowed back, the land and the food were still so poisoned by radiation that they had to be removed all over again. To this day, the home they gave up remains too dangerous to live on, and their descendants are scattered across other islands, carrying the memory of a place most of them have never seen. This is the history that the scholar argued the cartoon was quietly sitting on top of. An anthropologist at a major university, a researcher who had done extensive work with the people of the Marshall Islands and who served on a commission dealing with the nuclear legacy there, wrote an academic article making the case directly. She had been prompted to write it, she explained, by the death of the show's creator the year before, and by what she felt was missing from the tributes that followed. Amid all the warm remembrances, she noticed, there had been no mention at all of the real history embedded in the show's setting, no acknowledgement of the displaced people whose homeland had lent the cartoon its famous name. That silence struck her as a problem worth writing about. Her argument was sharp and unsparing. She contended that by placing its cheerful story on the bottom of Bikini, the show took part in a broader practice of erasing a real indigenous community and normalizing the seizure of their land. She used strong words. She described the cartoon's presence on that setting as violent and as racist, and she argued that the show was guilty of helping to whitewash the violent military activities that had been carried out against the people of the Pacific. The sponge himself, in in her reading was a kind of American figure permitted to live freely in a place that the real inhabitants had been forced to abandon, and his cheerful obliviousness to the bombs that had emptied that place was, she suggested, a quiet expression of privilege. She went further than the name alone. She pointed to other details in the show that she read as a careless borrowing of Pacific culture, the kind of thing that takes pieces of a real people's world and turns them into decoration. She mentioned the brightly colored shirts the characters sometimes wear, the pineapple that serves as the hero's home, the tiki carvings, and the great stone heads that appear in the background of the underwater town, echoing the famous statues of a real Pacific island. To her, these scattered elements added up to a pattern, a habit of treating the cultures of the region as a grab bag of fun visual material, divorced from the real people and the real suffering they came from. The whole cheerful surface of the show, in her view, was built on an act of forgetting. It is worth pausing to note that the real connection between the cartoon and the atoll is not in dispute and was not invented by the scholar. The name is plainly drawn from the real place, and over the years, the people who made the show acknowledged as much, even confirming that the link to the nuclear testing was a genuine part of the show's strange origins rather than a coincidence. Long before this article appeared, fans had built elaborate theories around the same connection, imagining the odd creatures of Bikini Bottom as the mutated survivors of the radiation. The scholar was not pointing at a link that no one had noticed. She was taking a link that fans had treated as a fun curiosity and insisting that it ought to be treated, instead, as something serious and troubling, a reminder of real people who had lost everything. The reaction to her article was enormous and immediate, and most of it was hostile. The story was picked up first by conservative news outlet, which ran headlines announcing that a university professor had called SpongeBob a violent and racist colonizer. From there, it spread across a whole cluster of publications, each amplifying the others, until the article had become a national talking point. The framing in these stories was rarely sympathetic. The dominant tone was one of mockery and outrage, presenting the whole thing as a ridiculous overreach, an example of a scholar finding sinister meaning in an innocent children's cartoon, and of a university wasting its seriousness on such pursuits. The article became, for a stretch, a favorite target, held up as proof of everything its critics believed had gone wrong with academic life. The harshest responses dismissed the work entirely. One commentary likened it to a famous hoax in which writers had submitted deliberately absurd nonsense to academic journals to expose what they saw as a lack of rigor, suggesting that this article belonged in the same category of unserious scholarship. Others argued that it illustrated how a certain kind of political thinking was degrading education, taking something harmless and beloved and straining to read oppression into it. The basic complaint, repeated in many forms, was that a silly cartoon about a sponge could not reasonably be expected to carry the weight of a nuclear tragedy on its shoulders, and that blaming it for the suffering of real people was both unfair and a little absurd. Not every response was dismissive, though, and the fairer treatments of the article tried to separate the strong language from the genuine point underneath it. Some writers, while perhaps finding the harshest phrasings a step too far, acknowledged that the scholar had raised something real and worth sitting with. Whatever one thought of calling a cartoon racist, the underlying fact remained that an enormous global audience said the words Bikini Bottom every day without the faintest idea that a real bikini existed, or that real families had lost their home there and were still paying the price for it decades later. The article, in this gentler reading, was less an attack on a sponge than an attempt to use the sponge's fame to drag a forgotten history back into the light, to make people who would never read about nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands suddenly curious about the real place behind the joke. The scholar herself had described a small but telling moment that captured exactly what she was worried about. She had stood before a hall full of students and asked them what came to mind when they heard the words Bikini Bottom, and the whole room had answered at once, calling out the name of the cartoon with delight. Then she had asked what they knew about the real Bikini Bottom, the actual place in the ocean, and the room had fallen silent. Almost no one had any idea that the name belonged to a real location at all, let alone what had happened there. That silence, for her, was the entire problem in miniature, a vivid demonstration of how a cheerful name had completely swallowed a tragic one, until the suffering behind it had vanished from memory. There is a fair point to hold on both sides of this argument, and the honest account refuses to collapse it into a simple verdict. On one hand, the cartoon never set out to mock anyone or to bury anyone's pain, and the people who made it had quietly acknowledged the real history rather than hiding it. Asking a children's comedy to bear full responsibility for a nuclear catastrophe does seem to place an unreasonable burden on a show about a fry cook and his snail. The strong language of the article, calling a gentle cartoon violent and racist, struck even some sympathetic readers as more than the case could comfortably support. On the other hand, the basic observation at the heart of the work was hard to dismiss entirely. A real place really was emptied of its people. The cartoon really did borrow its name, and almost no one watching really did know. Those facts do not require the harshest framing to carry a certain quiet weight. What the whole controversy revealed, more than anything, was how much meaning a beloved cartoon can be made to carry, and how fiercely people will fight over what that meaning should be. To the scholar, the show was a window onto a forgotten injustice, a chance to make the world remember a small and faraway tragedy. To her critics, it was an innocent pleasure being unfairly conscripted into a political argument it had never asked to join. Both sides were, in their way, doing the same thing the preachers and the scientists before them had done, pouring their own concerns into the blank and cheerful surface of the show, and reading their own meaning back out of it. The sponge stayed silent, as he always did, while adults argued over what he secretly stood for. The deeper truth the argument pointed at was less about one cheerful cartoon than about how easily the wider world forgets the suffering of small, faraway places. The people of Bikini lost their home, their way of life, and their simple ability to return, and the world at large knew almost nothing about it. The cartoon did not cause that forgetting. The forgetting was already there, vast and old, long before the show ever borrowed the name. What the show did, perhaps, was sit at the brightest and most visible edge of it, a place where the gap between a happy surface and a heavy reality grew so wide that a scholar finally felt compelled to point at it and demand that people look. Whether that demand was fair or excessive, it succeeded at one thing. For a few weeks, an enormous number of people who had never heard of the real Bikini suddenly learned that it existed, and that the cheerful name they had sung along to for years had a much sadder twin hiding inside the very same sounds. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A scholar had looked at the happy little town and seen a buried tragedy, and the fight over her words pulled a forgotten history briefly into the light. Yet the loudest argument the sponge ever caused began with something far smaller, a single short message sent by the people who made him on a quiet morning during 1 June. Section 9. The tweet that would not settle. Some questions about a beloved character never truly get answered. They are raised, argued over, and then set down for a while, only to come roaring back years later when something stirs them up again. The question of who SpongeBob was, of what the cheerful sponge represented, and who could claim him, was exactly this kind of question. It had first burst into public view 15 years earlier, during the storm explored in an earlier chapter, when a powerful figure warned that the character was being used to carry a hidden message. That fight had faded, the show had sailed on, and the matter had gone quiet. It had not gone away. In the summer of 2020, a single short message from the people who made the show brought all of it flooding back, louder and more tangled than it had ever been. The message arrived on an ordinary Saturday in the middle of June, during the month that many places set aside to celebrate the gay community. The network that aired the show posted a brief note on social media to mark the occasion. It said, in plain and simple terms, that the company was celebrating that month and every month alongside the gay community and its allies. Attached to the note were colorful images of 3 characters drawn from the network's shows. One was a character voiced by a transgender actor from a live-action series. One was a figure from another animated show who had been established as attracted to more than one gender. And the third, the one that would set the whole internet alight, was SpongeBob himself, shown wrapped in the bright colors of a rainbow. The reaction was instant and enormous. Within hours, the idea that SpongeBob was gay had become one of the most talked about topics on social media, racing across the platform as people shared the image and argued over what it meant. To a great many fans, the message read as a confirmation, a quiet, official declaration that the character they had grown up with was a member of the gay community at last. They celebrated it, shared it with delight, and treated the long-running speculation about the sponge as finally settled. The internet had decided, years earlier, that SpongeBob belonged to them, owing largely to his gentleness and to the easy, loving closeness between him and Patrick, and now it seemed the people who made him had agreed. The network then did something that poured fuel on the whole thing. Shortly after posting the message, it turned off the ability to reply to it, so that the flood of responses could no longer gather underneath. To some, this looked like a deliberate and knowing move, a refusal to entertain any debate about what had just been said. People joked that the company had announced the character was gay and then closed the door before anyone could argue, treating the matter as beyond discussion. Whether the replies were shut off to avoid an argument or simply to manage an overwhelming wave of attention, the effect was the same. The silence underneath the message made it feel even more like a statement that would not be taken back. But the message itself was more careful and more ambiguous than the loudest reactions made it sound, and this is where the question began to slip out of everyone's grasp. The note had not actually said that SpongeBob was gay. It had said only that the network was celebrating the gay community and its allies, and it had included the sponge among the faces marking that celebration. That left a great deal of room for interpretation. Was the character being identified as gay? Was he simply being shown as a friend and supporter of the community rather than a member of it? Or was the truth something else again, tied to a different reading of the character that some fans had held for years? That third reading rested on the words of the show's own creator, words that resurfaced immediately as the debate raged. Back during the earlier controversy, he had described SpongeBob and Patrick as having no romantic dimension at all, using the term almost asexual to capture how he saw them. To many fans, this was the real answer, and it fit the celebration in its own way, since a character who experiences no romantic or sexual attraction can still be understood as belonging under the broad umbrella the network was honoring. By this reading, the sponge had been included not as a gay character, and not merely as an ally, but as an asexual one, a figure whose lack of romantic interest was itself a kind of identity worth acknowledging. There was even a fitting biological echo to it, since real sea sponges, the creatures the character is based on, reproduce in ways that do not require a partner at all. So the single short message produced not one answer, but three, each held firmly by different parts of the audience. Some were certain it confirmed the sponge was gay, some insisted it marked him only as an ally, and some pointed back to the creator's old words and argued he was asexual. The network never clarified which of these it had meant, and that silence allowed all three readings to live on side by side, none of them ever fully winning. The question that had seemed, for one excited weekend, to be settled at last turned out to be as open as it had ever been, simply argued over by more people and with more heat. The people connected to the show offered glimpses of their own views in the time that followed, though even these did not close the matter. The actor who has voiced SpongeBob for the character's entire life spoke warmly about his counterpart being recognized as a friend to the community, expressing pride that the sponge could stand as a symbol of kindness and acceptance. A senior member of the show's creative team, when pressed, pointed back to the creator's long-standing answer, suggesting that the question had been addressed years before and that the late creator's view that the character was not gay should still stand. Two different emphases, one leaning toward warm inclusion and one toward the creator's original intent, neither of them a flat and final ruling that everyone could accept. The reaction was not entirely joyful either. Where there was celebration, there was also objection, and a familiar kind of complaint rose up from those who felt the network had no business attaching such matters to a children's character at all. The same accusation that had been leveled 15 years earlier returned almost word for word, the charge that the show was pushing an agenda onto young viewers. The argument that had played out on a dinner stage and a news network in the earlier era now played out in the comment sections and quote replies of social media. The venue changed, but the substance remarkably unchanged. For all the years that had passed, the country was still arguing over the same questions, and the cheerful sponge was still, somehow, standing in the middle of the fight. What made this whole affair so revealing was how perfectly it echoed everything that had come before. Once again, an enormous group of people had poured their own meaning into the blank and gentle surface of the character. Some saw a triumph of inclusion, some saw an overstep, some saw an asexual figure quietly affirmed, and the character himself, as always, said nothing, carried no statement of his own, and simply remained whatever each viewer needed him to be. The sponge had spent his entire existence being filled with the hopes and fears and arguments of the adults around him, and this was merely the latest and largest example, a single short message that managed to hold three contradictory meanings at once and refused to choose between them. The deeper reason the question would not settle has less to do with the character than with what people wanted from him. A figure that millions have loved since childhood becomes a kind of shared property, and different people lay claim to that property in different ways. To those who had embraced him as a gay icon, settling the question in their favor was a way of seeing themselves welcomed and reflected in something they had loved. To those who insisted on the creator's original intent, holding the line was a way of protecting the character as he had been made. To those who read him as asexual, the answer offered recognition for an identity that rarely gets acknowledged at all. None of these desires could be satisfied without disappointing the others, and so the question stayed open, not because the truth was unknowable, but because too many people needed the truth to be a different thing. Years later, the debate has never fully closed, and it likely never will. The short message remains, the readings remain, and every Pride season tends to stir the argument back to life. The sponge goes on being claimed and counterclaimed, celebrated and objected to, a gentle cartoon creature standing at the center of one of the longer-running arguments about identity in popular entertainment. He was built to make children laugh. He became, almost by accident, a mirror in which a whole society kept catching sight of its own unresolved questions, and a single short message on a quiet June morning proved that the mirror was still working 15 years after it first caught the light. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A few words on a screen had reopened a question the show could never quite close, and the sponge stayed silent at the heart of it as he always had. Yet one last trouble remained, the strangest of them all, when the world itself changed overnight and an old, harmless episode suddenly became something the show had to quietly take away. Section 10. The Pandemic Hull and the Long Shadow. The final piece of trouble in this long story did not come from a bad joke, a powerful critic, or a scholar with an argument. It came from the world itself changing overnight, and from an episode that had been perfectly innocent on the day it was made becoming, through no fault of its own, something the show felt it could no longer air. The story of this last removal is gentler than most of the others, and in some ways sadder, because it shows a beloved show being caught out by history, punished for a coincidence that no one involved could possibly possibly have seen coming. The episode in question belongs to a much later season of the series, and its premise was meant as nothing more than a silly bit of comedy. In the story, a health inspector arrives at the Krusty Krab and discovers a case of an illness called the clam flu among the people inside. To stop it from spreading, everyone in the restaurant is sealed in together under a strict quarantine, trapped in one room with no way out. As the characters are shut in with one another, fear slowly takes hold and they begin to turn suspicious, each one growing convinced that someone nearby must be the one carrying the sickness. The whole thing was built as a goofy excuse to lock the cast in a single space and watch them panic and bicker, a familiar kind of comic setup with no deeper meaning attached to it. The trouble was entirely a matter of timing. The episode was pulled in the year 2020, at the exact moment when a real disease had swept across the entire planet and reshaped daily life for billions of people. A lighthearted cartoon about a contagious illness, a forced quarantine, and neighbors growing afraid of one another suddenly struck far too close to home for a worldwide audience living through precisely that experience. The network took the episode out of circulation, explaining that it was being held back out of sensitivity to the real crisis unfolding outside everyone's windows. A comedy about a spreading sickness was simply not what frightened families needed to be shown, while the real thing raged around them. The fairest thing to say about this one is that the resemblance was pure, unlucky coincidence. The episode had been written roughly 2 years before the real pandemic ever began, long before anyone making it could have imagined what was on the way. The clam flu storyline was meant as a harmless joke and nothing more, a way to trap the characters together and mine their panic for laugh, with no connection whatsoever to real events. The show simply had the rotten luck of having made a story that the real world would soon turn into something painful to watch. There was no mistake in the episode itself, no lapse in judgment to point at. There was only the cruel accident of history catching up with a cartoon. Caution of this kind was everywhere during those years, and the show was far from alone in facing it. All sorts of films and television programs that touched on plagues, quarantines, or spreading illness were quietly shelved or delayed while the real crisis was at its worst. The instinct behind all of it was the same, a wish to avoid adding fresh fear or fresh grief to an audience already carrying far too much of both. Removing one cartoon episode was a small thing in the middle of an enormous global emergency, but it reflected a wider care, a sense across the whole industry that some stories, however innocent, were better set aside until the world was ready to hear them again. For the families actually living through it, the gesture was easy to miss and easy to appreciate once noticed. A child stuck at home, cut off from school and friends, did not need a favorite show turning the strange new reality into a punchline, and unlike some of the other removals in this story, this one was always meant to be temporary. Once the worst of the crisis had eased and life began inching back towards something like normal, the network restored the episode and made it available again, a little over a year after it had been taken down. The ban had been an act of caution rather than a judgment against the story, and when the moment for caution passed, the episode quietly returned, free once more to be enjoyed as the harmless comedy it had always been meant to be. Placed beside the very first removal in this story, the two form a neat mirror of the two main ways a show can fall into trouble after the fact. One episode was buried because of what was actually inside it, a gag the network came to view as wrong for young eyes no matter when it aired, and that one was gone for good. The other was buried because of when it happened to arrive, a perfectly innocent story made briefly unbearable by world events that nobody could have predicted, and that one came back. The first kind of trouble lives inside the work itself. The second kind floats in from the world around it and then drifts away again. Between them, they capture nearly the whole range of reasons a beloved show ends up hiding its own episodes. Step back from all of it, and a single shape appears again and again across everything this story has covered. Time after time, a gentle and cheerful surface turned out to be sitting on top of something heavier, stranger, or sadder than a casual glance would ever catch. An episode about a midlife crisis hit a joke the network would come to regret. A story about a tiny villain went to a place of genuine despair. A cluster of episodes turned cruelty and disgust against the very characters fans loved most. A famous gag was quietly erased over a real fear of imitation. A whole era of the show soured in ways that broke its audience's heart. And from outside, preachers, scientists, and scholars each looked at the bright little cartoon and found in it something they believed was secretly doing harm. The pattern holds because of what the show is, and what it became. SpongeBob grew so large, so beloved, and so deeply woven into childhood for an entire generation that it stopped being merely a cartoon and turned into a kind of shared surface, bright and familiar and trusted, onto which people could project whatever they most hoped or feared. A figure that Universal was always going to attract this kind of attention. When a thing belongs to everyone, everyone feels entitled to decide what it means, and the gentler and simpler that thing appears, the more room it leaves for others to fill it with weight it never asked to carry. What is most striking, looking back across all of these controversies together, is how rarely any of them were really about the sponge at all. The fights over his identity were fights the whole society was already having. The worry over his speed was a worry about screens and childhood that reached far beyond one show. The argument over his hometown's name was an argument about memory and forgetting that the cartoon had merely brought to the surface. Even the removed episodes were less about the stories themselves than about shifting standards and unlucky timing. The show sat at the center of each storm, silent and unchanged, while the real subject was always the people doing the arguing and the moment they happened to be living through. Through every speech, every study, every petition, and every pulled episode, the cartoon itself simply carried on. It never answered its critic. It never explained itself. It went on flipping patties and chasing jellyfish and racing from one joke to the next, as cheerful and oblivious as it had ever been. The controversies gathered around it and then faded, one after another, and the show outlasted nearly all of them. Still bright, still silly, still beloved by the children watching it now who know nothing of the fights their parents once had over it. That endurance is its own quiet answer. A gentle thing, made with care and loved by millions, can absorb an astonishing amount of trouble and still remain, at its heart, exactly what it always was.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.